This is the first video in my Casting Shadows series where I'm going to compare shadows and reflections, and it's in my book, Ellen's Guide to Casting Shadows on Amazon. Here's an object on a reflecting surface like water. The incident light ray from the object goes down to the reflecting surface and then bounces back as the reflecting ray, so that angle 1 is the same as angle 2. The eye follows this reflecting ray down, so it thinks that the object is below the water here and is an upside down version of the actual object. Here we see the reflection of a tree that's close to the lake and also next to a reflection of a mountain that's far away. So how do we know where to place the reflections? Well, the only way to do it is to look at the side view. And so here's the eye, and here's the tree on the other side of the lake. And the top of the tree reflects closer to the eye than does the bottom of the tree. And as a result, we see an upside down tree. Now, what about this distant tree? Where does that go? Well, you just follow it down till it reflects to the eye, and you'll see that it's above the nearby tree. So this would be what the eye would see. Shadows are caused by the lack of direct light. In other words, these buildings block the light from getting to these shaded areas. In contrast, reflections are from bouncing light. So the light will come, hit the bird, then it will go down to the water, and then it will go to our eye. The shadows are opposite the light source, so it varies with the position of that source. And here, the side of the glasses cause these shadows that radiate out because the sun is in the middle up here somewhere. Reflections, on the other hand, are always underneath the object like these yellow flames. So they vary with the position of the viewer. Shadows are best seen with matte or opaque surfaces, and we should see underneath. Here we see a shadow on tile, and when I remove the tile, it looks less like a shadow. Reflections, on the other hand, are on shiny surfaces that are either opaque or translucent, and we do not see underneath. So for example, with this water, we see the reflection, but we can't see under the water. Shadows are darkest near the casting surface, like this wheel shadow, and then gets lighter as it moves away from the object. The gradation from light to dark in either direction makes this surface look horizontal. In contrast, when we don't vary the values, the shadow is less convincing and the surface looks more vertical. Reflections, in contrast, mirror the values of the object, like these dark pine cones are dark in the reflection. Shadows tend to have colors complementary to the light, and since light is usually yellow or orange, shadows tend to have some blue or violet in them, especially outdoors where the blue sky sends blue light everywhere. We don't see the blue tinge in the lit area because the sun is so much more powerful than the blue skylight that it eliminates any blue tinge in this lit area. So we see the blue mainly in the shadows and the shade. Reflections have the colors of the object, like green grass, and the light, like the yellow sun. So how do the shapes and sizes of shadows and reflections differ? Shadows vary with the direction of the light, with perspective, and with the position of the viewer. Reflections, on the other hand, are upside-down versions of the subject. They're as long as the subject, and they always lie directly underneath the subject. Let's evaluate this picture. So in the first diagram, I connected the hands of the people to the shadows of their hands, and that gives us the light direction that goes to the sun. In the second diagram, I connected all the shadows together, and that gives us a shadow vanishing point on the horizon, which is directly below the sun. Shadows help us understand the picture. So in my drawing here, this middle guy is touching the ground because he's touching his shadow. This one is in the air because he's not touching his shadow. We probably wouldn't really appreciate that difference if it weren't for the shadows. And this shadow, well, he has a mind of his own. There are several situations when we see both shadows and reflections. In a swimming pool, we'll see the shadow on the bottom of the pool, and we'll see little reflections on top from the person and the float. Another is wet sand, where we see the shadow on the sand and it has a bluish tint, and we see the reflection from the thin layer of water on top of the sand, and it has a yellow tint. Shadows on water are best seen from a high viewpoint, like these shadows of the buildings. The water is green because it's a mix of blue skylight and the evening yellow sun. The shadows are tinted blue because they don't receive any yellow from the sun. The line between the light and the shadow is indistinct when we're on the beach. So this picture here is likely Photoshopped because a shadow, if we saw it at all, certainly wouldn't be this distinct with sharp edges. We also see both shadows and reflections when there's silt on the water. So this shadow is on top of the water and it has a blue-gray color, whereas the reflection underneath the bird is more yellow. Another situation is translucent objects, as we discussed before, where the shadows radiate out like this, and the reflections are directly underneath the glasses. We also see both shadows and reflections on semi-glossy surfaces. Since shadows are best seen on opaque surfaces and reflections are best seen on shiny surfaces, they're both attenuated on semi-glossy surfaces. We don't see either one very well. So here's a shadow, and you see a vague reflection of the person and a reflection of the light source. These are reflections because they're directly underneath the birds and they have a uniform value, whereas shadows would be darkest near the birds. In this case, the objects are on glass, so we see reflections of the object on the glass, but the glass lets most light pass through so that the shadows are now actually on the back wall. For this house, we see the reflections of the vertical window panes because they follow the line of reflected light coming to our eye, but we don't see reflections of the horizontal panes. This is a summary of the characteristics of shadows and reflections, and I'll let you read this on your own. My next video will be about the basics of shadow casting, and please remember to subscribe.